I've always been a guy who liked driving at night. The road is quieter, without the daytime traffic, and most of the time, with that silence only the early hours can offer. I've taken many routes through the countryside, crossing states from one end to the other, and I've never been afraid of anything until that night. It was a long trip, traveling from one state to another, carrying cargo for a client who always demanded urgency. As usual, I prepared my coffee, filled up the tank, and set off in the early hours of the morning. I had my route planned, knew the road by heart, but something went off track. A storm was approaching, and lightning began to light up the sky before I even made it halfway through the trip. I'd been driving for hours when the rain started pouring hard, one of those downpours where the windshield wipers can barely keep up. That's when the GPS suggested an alternative route, a secondary road that would supposedly save me some time. I admit I hesitated at first. The main road was already tough with that storm, so taking a road I didn't know seemed like a bad idea. But thinking about the deadline and wanting to avoid delays, I decided to follow the instructions. After all, what could go wrong? As soon as I entered this road, the atmosphere seemed to change. The asphalt disappeared, and the dirt road, soaked by the rain, made driving difficult. The place was desolate, no streetlights, no houses in sight, just trees on both sides, dense, as if closing in on the path. But I pressed on. At first, I thought it was just a strange feeling from being in an unknown place in the middle of a storm. But the feeling started to get worse. The road seemed to narrow, and the trees leaned in as if they were getting closer to me. Or maybe it was just my imagination. Suddenly, something caught my attention. Up ahead, on the side of the road, I saw a figure. It was definitely a person. At first, I thought it was some lost pedestrian, a local resident, or someone hitchhiking. When I passed by, I realized it was a woman, dressed in some kind of long, old-fashioned dress, out of place for someone in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a torrential downpour. But the strangest thing was that she didn't seem to be asking for help or moving at all. She was just standing there, looking straight ahead, as if she didn't even see me pass by. My heart raced a bit, but I kept going. I didn't want to think too much about it. Maybe it was the rain, the unfamiliar road, but I started to feel a growing unease, like something was wrong. I continued for a few more kilometers until, without any warning, the truck began to lose power. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine slowly died until I had to pull over. I tried restarting it, but the truck just wouldn't start. I got out of the cab, under that torrential rain, and went to the front of the truck to see if anything was wrong. Everything seemed normal, as far as I could tell. No visible issues, but the engine wasn't responding. And that's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind, but then I realized it was something else. Something like whispers. Low, almost indistinguishable, but there. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was nearby, but there was nothing, just the road and the trees. I stood still for a moment, listening, but the whispers seemed to come from all directions at once. I went back to the truck, trying not to let paranoia take over. I tried starting the engine again, but nothing. The radio was dead, and my phone had no signal on that road. Silence returned, broken only by the sound of the rain hitting the truck's roof. And then I saw her again. Through the truck window, in the rearview mirror, there she was, the same woman I had seen before, standing by the side of the road. This time, though, she wasn't as far away. She was closer, maybe about 20 meters from the truck, and she was looking directly at me. What sent a chill down my spine was realizing that, despite the torrential rain, she was completely dry, as if the water wasn't touching her. She didn't move, just stared. I'm not someone who scares easily, but at that moment, fear started to take hold. I rolled up the windows, locked the doors, and sat there, not knowing what to do. I tried to think rationally. Maybe she was a local, maybe she was scared of the storm too. But deep down, I knew something very strange was happening. Time seemed to pass slowly. I sat there, waiting for some sign that the engine would start working again, when I heard a sound coming from the back of the truck. It was a knocking sound, firm, like someone was trying to get in through the back door. The problem was, as far as I knew, no one should be there. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do. I didn't have the courage to get out and check, but the knocking continued. I took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out, feeling my fear rise. I walked around to the back of the truck, shining the light. When I got closer, I realized there was no one there. But something was wrong. The back door was open. I knew I had closed it after loading the cargo, but now it was wide open, swinging in the wind. I shined the flashlight inside the truck and, seeing it was empty, felt a momentary relief. But when I returned to the cab, there she was again, the woman, standing beside the truck, even closer now. Her eyes were fixed on me, and a cold sensation ran through my body. I quickly got back into the cab, trying to ignore what was happening. That's when, suddenly, the engine started on its own. Without me turning the key, the truck came to life, and the lights came back on. I didn't think twice. I shifted gears and accelerated as fast as I could, leaving that road behind. As time passed and I moved further away from the road, things started to return to normal. The truck ran fine, the sound of the rain lessened, and that bad feeling I had slowly faded. I thought I had finally escaped. Then, just before dawn, I stopped at a gas station to rest and catch my breath. As I stepped out of the truck, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. On the windshield on the outside, there were marks, handprints, small, thin, like someone had pressed their hands there while I was driving. And that's when I realized, whatever I encountered on that road, it was still with me. That night, we left later than planned, so we hit the road already past midnight. We were all tired, but we wanted to get there quickly. My wife was asleep in the passenger seat, and our son, about 5 years old, was wrapped in a blanket in the back seat. He also seemed to be sleeping, or at least that's what I thought. The road was dark, with almost no street lights. The headlights lit up just a few meters ahead of us and all around. I could only see the shadows of trees lining the roadside. I was focused on driving when I heard my son's voice from the back. He murmured something, half asleep. I asked if he was okay, but he didn't answer. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that his eyes were closed. Maybe it was just a sleepy mumble, something normal for him. I brushed it off. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, he spoke more clearly, but what he said left me a little uneasy. "Dad, there's someone here." I looked in the rearview mirror again, and his eyes were open, but with a calm, almost serene expression. He didn't seem scared, but there was something about that sentence, something strange. I looked over at my wife, who was still sleeping, and decided not to wake her up. She was already exhausted, and I thought maybe our son was just talking in his sleep. "There's no one here, son," I replied, trying to sound as calm as possible. He looked at me and said, in an almost indifferent tone, as if stating the obvious, "Yes, there is, Dad. He's right there, next to Mommy." At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. I looked at the passenger seat, where my wife was still sleeping soundly. No one was there, of course, but that comment left me feeling uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just a child's imagination, something insignificant. I kept driving, trying to shake off that strange feeling. But the silence that had seemed peaceful before now felt heavy, oppressive. The road felt longer, and time seemed to pass more slowly. And then, out of nowhere, my son whispered something again. This time, he seemed to be speaking to someone else, someone who wasn't me. He said he's here to protect us, he murmured. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, and I started looking to the sides and the mirrors, trying to see if something was really wrong. But of course, I didn't see anything. "Protect us from what, son?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't say. My son replied calmly. The atmosphere in the car grew tense. The darkness outside seemed even heavier, and the sound of the wind against the car sounded like a constant whisper. It was as if the road was closing in around us, isolating us from the rest of the world. So, to try to distract myself, I turned on the radio. But what played was strange static, as if there was no signal. My son's voice came again. "He doesn't like the radio, Dad." I turned off the radio immediately. Now, fear was beginning to take hold. I looked in the rearview mirror, and my son's face was serious, his eyes fixed on the seat next to his mother's, as if he was really seeing something I couldn't see. It was a look that didn't belong to a child simply imagining something. It was a deep, intense look. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The car was in total silence, except for the sound of the tires on the road. Then, my wife woke up, stretched, and asked how the trip was going. I tried to play it cool, act naturally, but she noticed that I was acting strange. She asked if everything was okay, and I just nodded, saying yes. Before I could say anything more, my son looked at her and, in the softest voice in the world, said, "He said that now you can see him too, Mommy." My wife turned to him, confused. "Who, sweetie?" she asked, with a tired smile. He looked at the empty space beside her and smiled. "Daddy's invisible friend, the one who's protecting us." My wife laughed, thinking it was a joke, but I was pale. I tried to focus on the road, but every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw my son staring at that same spot, as if something really was there. Then he spoke quietly, almost whispering. "He's sad, Dad. He said he wanted to come with us, but he can't leave the road." That chilled me to the bone. What was he trying to say? I gripped the steering wheel tighter, anxious to get off that road and reach somewhere populated, well-lit, where I could feel safe. But my son continued. "He said he lives here, Dad. He takes care of everyone who passes by, but no one ever sees him." My wife was now suspicious, asking what was going on, but I didn't know what to say. I could only think of getting off that road quickly, as if something really was watching us, following us. After a while, silence returned to the car, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Finally, the road showed signs that we were nearing a town. The distant lights, the glow of street lamps, brought me a relief I couldn't describe. It was when my son looked into the rearview mirror one last time and said, "He said it's okay now, that we can go." He just wanted us to know he exists. I sped up, and soon we reached the first signs of civilization. The lit environment, the movement of other people, gave me a feeling of safety that seemed left behind in the darkness of the road. My wife still didn't understand, and I preferred not to explain. When we arrived at our destination, I helped my son out of the car. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "He liked us, Dad. He said that when we come back, he'll be waiting." Since that day, I've always avoided traveling at night with my family. I don't know what my son saw or heard, but I'm sure that on that road, we really weren't alone. That night, something different happened. I was carrying a load of car parts on a route I knew well, and the night was exactly how I liked it, silent, without a single car passing by. It was almost 2 a.m., and I'd been on the road for about 4 hours. Only the radio kept me company. The song playing was one of those old ones, the kind you've heard so many times that you barely notice. My focus was on the road, on the headlights illuminating the lane in front of me. Then, the radio made a strange sound, as if it were losing signal, which, at first, I didn't even find strange. It was a pretty remote area, so signal interference wasn't exactly rare. But then something happened that made my spine tingle. The song that was playing suddenly stopped, and the radio went silent for a few seconds. The silence was so thick it began to bother me. Then, suddenly, a voice appeared. It wasn't a typical radio announcer's voice. It was different. It was a low, hoarse voice that said my name. Yes, my name. Paul, it said, with a frightening calm. I froze at the wheel. My first reaction was to think it was some interference, someone speaking on another channel that accidentally mixed with the radio broadcast. But then the voice spoke again. "Paul, are you listening?" The hairs on my arms stood up. There was no static, no noise, just the voice, clear, as if it was speaking directly to me. I turned off the radio. Instinct. My hands were sweaty on the wheel, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was just too tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the silence inside the cab grew even more suffocating. It was as if the air was heavy, hard to breathe. I decided to turn the radio back on, just to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a coincidence. When I turned it on, the music was back, which relaxed me a bit. It was just some random song, the kind that plays on late-night radio, but it didn't last long. The music cut off again, abruptly, and the same voice returned. This time, it sounded closer, more insistent. "You shouldn't be here, Paul." I didn't know what to do. I looked around. The road was still empty, just the trees on either side and the asphalt ahead. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The voice continued, "You're listening, aren't you? I know you are." I tried to ignore it, turn up the radio volume, but the voice overpowered any sound. Even with the volume on high, the voice was clear, as if it were coming from inside my head. "You shouldn't have taken this route." My mind started racing, trying to find some explanation. Who could be speaking to me? And why through the radio? I looked at the dashboard, the radio display flickering erratically, as if the device were malfunctioning. But that voice stayed steady, as if nothing could disturb the broadcast. "Turn back," the voice said, this time with a firmness that chilled me to the bone. "You can still turn back." I didn't know what to answer, or if I should answer. It was as if the radio were being used by something different, something that wasn't human. I did what anyone would do. I spoke. "Who's there?" My voice came out shakier than I'd have liked. The response was immediate. "That doesn't matter, Paul. What matters is you're in the wrong place. You shouldn't be here." The radio crackled, followed by brief static, and then silence returned. I didn't know what to do. There was no more music, no voice, just the sound of the engine and the road. For a moment, I thought of grabbing my phone, calling someone, anyone, just to hear another voice, a familiar voice that would bring me back to reality. But my signal was dead, with no coverage, which only worsened the feeling of isolation. Gradually, I returned my focus to the road, trying to ignore what had just happened. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was too tired. I kept driving, forcing myself to return to the trip, to the delivery I needed to make. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about what the voice had said. Turn back. After a few minutes of silence, the radio made another sound, as if it were coming back to life. My heart sped up, and the voice, this time, sounded softer, almost a whisper. "There's still time, Paul. Don't go past that point." Then, I began to understand what it meant. Up ahead, in the headlights, a curve appeared. A curve I didn't remember being on the route. My stomach twisted. Whatever it was, that voice knew something. "Don't go past that curve," it repeated. My instincts were conflicted. Part of me wanted to hit the gas and pass the curve as fast as possible. Another part, the more sensible one, wanted to brake, to stop the truck right there. But as I hesitated, the voice on the radio said, for the last time, "It's your choice, Paul. I don't know what made me do it, but I slowed down and stopped the truck. Right there, in the middle of the road, a few meters from the curve." The rain began to fall, as if the sky had been waiting for that moment. I sat there, unmoving, with the engine running, the sound of rain hitting the windshield. And the radio went silent. I waited a few minutes, my mind trying to process everything that had happened. What lay beyond that curve? Why had the voice warned me? But, for some reason, I decided not to find out. I put the truck in reverse, and with trembling hands, I turned around. The radio didn't work for the rest of the night. I arrived at my destination in the morning without any further interruptions. I never found out what might have happened if I'd ignored the voice, and maybe it's better that way. Since that day, I don't listen to the radio on my night drives. Now, I prefer the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't talk back to me. I've never been a fan of driving at night. The darkness on the road has always made me uncomfortable, but that night, I didn't have a choice. I received a call in the middle of the night. My mother had been admitted to a hospital in a city 3 hours away from where I was. Without hesitation, I grabbed my car keys and hit the road. My only thought was to reach the hospital as quickly as possible to see how she was. As soon as I got on the highway, the feeling of discomfort started to weigh on me more than usual. The road was deserted, and the beams from my car headlights cut through the darkness like a small island of light in a vast black ocean. With each mile, the silence around me seemed to grow heavier. There were no other cars, not even streetlights in some stretches. Only the sound of the engine and the tires rolling over the asphalt. Then I noticed a pair of headlights appearing in my rearview mirror. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. After all, I wasn't the only one driving that night, right? But something about the way that car was keeping the exact same distance bothered me. It didn't feel like a coincidence. It seemed deliberate. I increased my speed, and the car did the same. When I slowed down to see if it would pass, it stayed right behind me without falling back. At first, I thought it might be an impatient driver, maybe someone just tagging along to see the road better. But as the miles passed, the car wouldn't get off my tail. I was growing tense, with a creeping feeling of unease building inside me. Why wasn't it overtaking? Why did it stay so close without pushing me? I tried to ignore it and focus on the road ahead, but I couldn't get the situation out of my head. I decided to do a test to see if it was really following me. A bit further on, there was an exit to a back road. I knew it wasn't the direct route to the hospital, but if I could lose that car, the detour would be worth it. I turned on my blinker, took the exit, and checked the rearview mirror. To my surprise, the car followed. Even though it was a detour to a dead-end road up ahead, it copied every move I made. My heart raced, and a thin layer of sweat started to form on my hands despite the early morning chill. It was clear that this wasn't a coincidence. That driver was following me. At that point, my mind was racing. Who could it be? Why would someone be following me on a deserted road in the middle of the night? I thought about stopping the car, getting out, and confronting the driver, but something told me that wasn't the best idea. I decided it would be better to try to shake them off and get to the hospital as quickly as possible. I kept driving, trying to stay calm. My hands were tense on the wheel, and I constantly glanced at the rearview mirror. The car behind me showed no signs of giving up. I remembered a shortcut that was a little farther ahead, a small road that cut through and reconnected to the main road later on. It was risky, but I didn't have many options. As soon as I reached the entrance to that shortcut, I turned the wheel suddenly and took it without signaling or slowing down. Adrenaline surged through me as I looked back, hoping the car would be left behind. But, to my surprise and alarm, the other driver made the same turn, following my detour. My heart was beating so fast I could feel each pulse echoing in my ears. Who was this person, and why were they following me? The minutes dragged on, and the road seemed increasingly deserted and dark. Suddenly, I realized that fear was clouding my judgment. If I didn't think clearly, I might make dangerous decisions. I took a deep breath and decided to try one last thing. Get back on the main road and speed up. There had to be a chance to shake off the pursuer. I made the turn back and pressed the accelerator, gradually picking up speed, trying to put distance between us. After a few minutes with no sign of the pursuer, I began to relax, thinking I might have finally managed to lose them. But when I looked in the rearview mirror again, there they were, the same headlights, a bit farther back but unmistakable, glowing in the darkness. By now, the tension was almost unbearable. All I wanted was to reach the hospital and put this behind me. I decided I'd do whatever it took to lose that car. So I took a series of random turns, in and out of small roads, speeding up, trying to put some distance between us. Finally, after one last sharp turn, I looked in the rearview mirror, and to my relief, the car had disappeared. I don't know if they gave up or lost track, but what mattered was that I was finally alone on the road again. I didn't fully relax until I reached the city entrance, with the hospital lights coming into view in the distance. I parked at the hospital, still with trembling hands and a racing heart. When I saw my mother, all the fear and tension from that pursuit faded away. In that moment, everything else fell into the background. My mother was stable, and that was what mattered most to me. On the way back, I made sure to drive during the day. I'd never know why that car followed me, but one thing is certain, That night was one of the tensest experiences of my life. And if I can help it, I never want to go through anything like that again. If you like this content, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell. Thank you and see you in the next video.